Hi everyone, we hope you're having a wonderful time at Microsoft Build. My name is Jessica Craig, I'm a developer advocate at LaunchDarkly, and I'm joined by Michael Gillett over at Wind Technologies, proud member of the Betway Group. He's going to talk to us about his career trajectory, his time as a Microsoft MVP, rather, and we're going to talk about the DORA metrics and whether or not they really make a difference to development teams. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. It's going to be a really good conversation as we dig into how we make use of feature management and where that began and where we've ended up today.
Precisely. I'd love to hear about your job title at the Betway Group, if that's okay.
Yeah. So it's a lengthy job title, and it's changed a bit. So I started off. Let's take on a little bit of a journey. So I started off as a junior dev at the company a little while ago. We don't need to go into how long ago. And then that was more of a front end technology focus. And then I moved to a full stack team and then became a team lead there and have progressed around a few different teams and then became an architect. And then more recently became head of software development. And then more recently than that, I also look after the product and UI and UX element at Wind Technologies. And that's been a very interesting, well-rounded kind of experience of understanding the needs of the business and how technology can enable that.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like that. I mean, throughout your career there, you've had you've experienced so many different parts of the business. When we started working together, we're kicking off around, it was back when hypothesis-driven development was very much your focus.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about where we as a company started looking at actually feature management, and we ended up choosing LaunchDarkly as the way to do that. But where it began was actually our marketing teams wanted to be able to run A/B tests on landing pages. And we went through a review exercise of what the different technologies out there could offer us in terms of doing that. What I would now look back on as a fairly simple type of experiment and a very limited use case of feature management. And what drew us to LaunchDarkly was actually its kind of unbiased view of technology, in that you could use it on whatever technology, kind of in whatever scenario you wanted. And that, because it was our tech team who was making that choice and evaluating it, we quickly saw opportunities for a lot more than just doing landing page A/B tests. And that has led us on this path of quite surprising and fascinating outcomes as we've kind of adopted feature management in its entirety, and we're still finding new ways to do that. And I kind of think that in many ways it comes down to just that simplicity of really, and I don't want to make this sound overly simplistic because there's a lot of stuff going on here, but really feature management boils down to a Boolean, right? It's just an if statement. But where the interesting bit comes from is how are you determining when it's the true or the false? And that's fascinating.
And throughout this is one of the reasons why Wind Technologies is such an interesting use case to me, because it's very much, you've been on that as a sort of parallel to your career journey throughout the company. You've also transformed the way that you work with developer tools, and has that changed the way that you think about developer experience, like having had that firsthand?
Yeah, absolutely. So to think of it again, like back to looking at it first at experiments and A/B tests, you can do a lot more than A/B tests. You obviously have multivariate tests. But another aspect of feature management is not just running experiments. It's about being able to roll something out. And what I mean by that is, we've obviously, with DevOps, and we'll probably cover this in a bit more detail soon, but like with DevOps, the view has always been around ensuring that deployments are safe, that they're repeatable, reliable, and that you can do them quite quickly and cheaply. But what feature management allows us to do is separate a deployment from the release of a feature.
Exactly.
And actually that further mitigates that risk to your production environment, because what we start seeing is production environment might not be what the customers are experiencing. It's the environment that they will experience it, but you might be deploying to production, but not revealing any new functionality yet to the customers. And in that regard, this might be a bold statement to make, and I'm going to make it anyway. Production environment becomes the test environment and arguably is the best test environment, but it isn't the environment in which customers should do the testing.
Exactly. A friend of mine always says there's no production like production. And I think that's why this case is so interesting. I was quite pleased when you said that you really wanted to talk about the DORA metrics, because obviously we're talking about 7 different versions of an environment. That's excellent. That's a sort of surface level application. But things get really interesting when you start to apply feature management to the really operational level of powering production. How have you transformed the way that you've worked? I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah. So when you get to this view of seeing a feature flag as a way of deploying something to production in a safe way, and then being able to turn on the feature to customers, but maybe not to customers initially. Maybe you want to turn it on to stakeholders and do a bit of UAT, perhaps. That's a brilliant way of being able to do that, because you're not managing environments. You kind of show it off to a stakeholder and they can see it, they can sign it off, and then you can start turning it on for actual customers. Now, what that can actually kind of afford us is, well, look, if a form of testing can be done on production, how much testing can be done on production? And arguably, most can be done on production, which in some cases actually led our teams to remove test environments entirely. So they go from their dev machine to production, and that's it. Now, that does require a lot of considerations within the release pipeline. There are lots of tests that go on, and you could spin up a test environment to make sure that happens, but it depends what tests you're doing, because as long as you can deploy to a staging set of your production app in that flow of getting it to production, you can do perhaps regression testing on the local machine. You can do it on your staging environment, and then if you're doing slot swaps, live green, live blue, you could actually just do your regression at that point. You don't necessarily need to maintain an environment. Now, that doesn't work for every system. It won't work for every company or team. But where it can work, it saves a lot of time and money, because to that point around production being the best kind of test environment, it takes a lot of time to keep a test environment like production.
Completely.
And whether that is the configuration, whether that's the scale of it, whether it's the peaks in traffic, the changing nature of the traffic. But then you also have to have the cost of running something that is like production, just sitting there until you want to do some testing. And you might be doing lots of testing, but probably most of the time your test environment isn't behaving like production. It's actually a very expensive copy of production. So you spend a lot of time keeping it correct. You also spend a lot of money having it there.
Sounds like a process that you must have had to have had a lot of conversations. That must have taken a lot of that must have taken a lot of education and working with colleagues from outside of your team to get them to kind of see your vision there.
Definitely. And I think actually where a big part of that is the autonomy, but also the accountability that we give to our teams. So they're fully responsible for their product, from the commit through to production, and then the maintenance of it in production. We don't have an ops team that looks after it when it's in prod. If something goes wrong at 2 a.m, it's that team who built that thing who are getting woken up to fix it. So if you remove feature management just for a minute from the equation, you're looking at the cloud, and you need to understand what deployments have been made and what the infrastructure is like of that setup within the cloud. And actually, in many ways, feature management is just another aspect of that kind of production management aspect. And so it is a little jarring to people who have never used feature management, who aren't that familiar with doing lots of deployments a day and doing very small iterative changes. But actually, generally, when you have that conversation with people around, well, look, if we are going to make a release and something's going to break, and we're the ones who are going to have to fix it, wouldn't it be better if we're dealing with a small change rather than a big change that is difficult to roll back, difficult to turn off? Even once you've got production back to a good state, how are you identifying where that individual little bug is? Well, if you've got little changes, that's very easy to do. But that goes nicely with feature management. If you've got relatively small things that are all nicely encapsulated within feature flags, you know that you can just turn that thing off and you're not degrading your whole system. It's literally one aspect of it that's just being turned off. And with feature management, if you are struggling to debug, you can keep it turned on for yourself, but not your customers, and go and understand why it's not working in that regard. And I will even touch on so that's kind of how we get there. It's a conversation and it's ownership and people understanding the benefit of being able to really, to lesser and greater extents, with fine grain kind of control over the actual product that customers are experiencing. That is a lot better for those teams who are fully accountable for that production environment working. But where there's something else that's quite interesting, in the scenario I said that you could leave a broken thing on for yourself to go and debug it further. We also have done, I don't really have a good name for this, but it's effectively the opposite of a kill switch, where the kill switch concept, many of you will probably be aware of this, but it is the idea that you have perhaps a non-essential piece of functionality in your product, but it might be quite resource intensive. If you're experiencing real high load, you might want to turn it off to free up some of that resource. So you've killed that feature. The opposite, we've used in a couple of scenarios where we might actually turn on verbose logging for individual customers who might come to the call center and say, I've got this problem. We can't see in the logs quite why this problem presents itself. And we could go and turn on extra logs for that one customer that might shed some light on what it is that they're encountering and where that bug really lies.
And when you're talking about this process is almost, you're overhauling the way that responsibility works within your team as well. When it comes to cleanup and when it comes to maintenance, did that accountability naturally follow when you implemented those sort of processes and those sort of reverse kill switches?
So the cleanup one is an interesting one. It's a difficult one. And I think the reason why is it can be that, like stakeholders obviously want to be able to look to people, hold teams and processes responsible for things. So when we're working on implementing a feature and rolling that out to customers, and if it goes wrong, we need to turn it off or fix it, whatever, that kind of everyone's on board with that. But then when you talk about cleaning up something, there's no tangible, perhaps visible artifact of that. It's actually the removal of something. So the challenge that we have had is keeping visibility on that work, because you can quite easily forget about it. And the other is making sure that there's priority to actually get to that work, because you're just tidying something up. So there are a couple of ways that we do this. And again, with teams being reasonably accountable and autonomous, they've actually approached it in different ways that suits the way that they work. One fun way is we create subtasks for the tickets that we have. And one of the subtasks for every single feature that is being built with a feature toggle would be to have, it's a bathtub emoji because it's the wash up subtask. And it's there for everyone. And so that high level ticket isn't done until all of the subtasks are done. But you can't get to the cleanup ticket or subtask for a little while, because if you're rolling it out, you might want to take that, just be a bit methodical with it. And if you're running an experiment, you might need to wait a few weeks to reach your statistical significance. That solves some of the visibility problem, and it also solves, we work in Kanban with WIP limits and stuff, so it actually ensures that that ticket can't be finished yet, which is eating up a WIP limit item. So we need to get rid of that at some point, and that helps to get that priority there. The downside to that is you might have a ticket there for a long time, and that needs to be well managed as well, because that might start skewing the metrics of, well, what's the lead time to get work done? But is work being done literally just writing the code and getting it to production, or is it writing the code, putting it into production, rolling it out, experimenting, seeing that customers want it, seeing that it's adding the value that we wanted, then making the decision, then going, right, we've finally implemented it in the correct way, which is actually including the cleanup of it. That might actually be a much broader definition of what done is for a ticket. And this is where, like, coming back to DORA and good DevOps practice and things, is where I see feature management beginning to be this extension of the process that hasn't always been there. And it's a fairly new concept anyway. I mean, LaunchDarkly itself is 7 years old. I mean, it's not that old, and DevOps as a practice is a bit older than that. But at the time when DevOps was kind of really thought about, and the DORA metrics, again, they're slightly more recent, but feature management hasn't really been the normal way of doing things. But I think it extends the DevOps practice, and we need to start thinking about just tailoring that DevOps view, because it's very focused on deployments. And when you're able to control when a feature is going live and not, your deployments matter a lot less in that metric view.
I was thinking about this just the other day. Exactly. When it comes to the DORA metrics, we really have a bit of an obsession with that deployment frequency metric, which is obviously very important. It's really important to kind of to look at how, I mean, you mentioned the idea of keeping batch sizes small, that sort of methodical approach to work. But the sort of MTTR, that sense of sort of resilience in your production platform, that is, if you can run fast at a problem, that's excellent. But if it takes you a long time to get up, that's also going to make you far less competitive as a business, no?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think all four of the DevOps, the DORA metrics, which aren't the only measure of good software development, but I think they're a widely adopted good measure. They can all be improved by using feature management. So, yeah, the deployment frequency, I think, does significantly get improved because you're encapsulating your new code, so the risk of breaking production is much less for customers. You might break production for yourself or for your QAs or for stakeholders or whatever. You might do that. And actually, we've got the team that go from dev to production. The reason why we're able to do that is not only because the pipeline is something that we've really taken care of and make sure that there's automation tests, integration tests, regression, smoke, all of the testing going on at every step along the way, but it's also the way that we must build code is that when you're putting your new code into the code base, you're doing that in your feature flag encapsulation. That has to be done in that way, because otherwise the risk is too high that you're basically just putting new code into prod in front of customers. Even though you might have some tests, if you've not catered for that yet, then look, you're going to have a problem. And so it has to be written in that way. And there must be quite a strong view of the right way to encapsulate the new code, which is it's only ever executed when you're returning your true value in that feature flag, Boolean check. And that the default, the false, that's where the existing functionality lives. And we've had some nasty experiences why I can speak so strongly that it should be that way around, because if you don't do it that way around, you will have problems. But that helps that deployment time. And in fact, where we're getting to as a certainly some of our teams and perhaps as a company and a department in general, we see the DORA metrics as kind of once you achieve that expert category of those metrics.
Yeah.
Does it matter that you can release once a day, 5 times a day, 20 times a day, 100 times a day? Probably not so much, because at that point, you really want to chase an improving metric. Like, why do you want to do 20 and then 21 and then 22 releases a day? That actually is probably starting to get a little bit detrimental to the value of the work that's now going out.
Definitely. I think assessing that value per release and how that changes over time is super important. Did you, when you were taking on the DORA metrics in your team and measuring them, did you start to add those additional, like those additional, your version of those, or the ones that kind of work best for your
yes.
How did you start
to? We started building on that. So we actually, one of our teams works in a way that actually it kind of comes from the idea that good practice would be that probably at the end of the day, you should commit the code changes that you've been working on. Even if it's not finished, you should probably commit them, because you never know. Your laptop might die or whatever, and you come in the next day and it's wasted your day's work. So it's probably always good to commit where you're at. Mm-hmm. Well, in that same regard, would it not be good to commit, merge, and deploy to production your daily work, even if it's not finished? But it probably is, and therefore one of our teams actually adopted the view of one commit, one deployment per dev per day.
Oh, the first time I heard that, my mind was a little bit blown. Is that on your straight to production team? They do one deploy per day.
That team does go through a test environment, but it's a spun up test environment. The tests are done, that environment's written down, and on it goes to production. It's generally, that one is a fully automated pipeline to production. So it's not quite as extreme, but it's still a pretty much automated pipeline to production. There can be a bit of manual testing. It depends what it is that we're working on there. But yeah, it's a fun metric to have, and it ensures that we aren't introducing things to our pipelines and deployments that slow us down. Because if that's the metric that we want to be achieving, well, that pipeline needs to be rock solid, and it needs to be quick, and we need to be able to do that.
And in addition to the processes, you obviously need to really empower your developer team, right? They've got to have real confidence in the tests that they're running and the code that they're pushing to that production environment. And that can, I mean, I'm just speaking because the idea of just going straight to production every day, I was just like, that sounds scary. Did you have to, like, how did you work on your developer experience in your team?
Yeah, no, if I think back to when I started as a junior dev and the way that the department worked, it was very much, well, it works on my machine, give it to the ops team. The ops team will go and deploy it, and they'll find a problem, and then it'll come back. And like that horror story that I'm sure many of us know of, and maybe some are still trying to kind of move away from. And it does take a lot of time, and it takes that buy-in and understanding of, but what is it we're trying to do? People in tech are always trying to meet the needs of the business and the customers. Mm-hmm. Now, what we want to do is get that change that can be implemented in front of customers as quick as possible, but as safely as possible. Mm-hmm. And that ends up kind of, what has happened in the past is it's kind of viewed as, well, we want to make changes as infrequently as possible and make sure that the changes going out is actually rock solid and that there are no bugs with it, and that when it gets to customers, they're going to enjoy it and it's going to work as we expected. But that's quite a slow way of actually being able to deliver change. So where you want to deliver change, because you're so scared about making a change, you've slowed the whole thing down to the point that, in extreme cases, by the time the change goes out, customers no longer want it anyway. So then the flip side is, well, how can you make a change so cheap, quick, and easy to get out that you can get it out to customers, and if they no longer want it, you can do another change and get rid of it? And that is a very long process, but it comes back again to that thing of, but if that's what everyone's trying to do, then you want the team that are building something to actually be responsible for it in production.
Yeah.
Because that changes their mindset. So we've got teams of developers, teams of QAs, but they form cross-functional teams. And we've come a long way from where, again, they might have been seen as, well, they do one thing and then you pass it over to get tested. We're in a much better place now. It's all about collaboration, because everyone should be concerned about quality. It isn't the concern of your QA or your tester. Everyone cares about quality, but there's expertise. What's the expertise of a software developer or an engineer versus a QA? Well, there are some slight differences, but probably all of them are writing code. So it isn't the view that engineers or developers are the ones who write code and QAs and testers are the ones that test it. That's not right, because QAs and testers will be writing code to test it. So it's about then understanding, well, what is that objective? Well, it's actually, what do QAs do? Well, they think about, how could something be used? How could it break? What are the types of tests that we would want to run? And then you end up with testing your schema of things. We're not just functionally testing stuff, but we'll check that if there's a config file, is the schema of the config file right? Because that's a cheap test to do. Do that early on. And if that's gone wrong, then stop the build and release. And But do you want your QA to write that, or do you want a dev to write that, or an engineer? Does it matter? Probably not. Now anyone can write it, but everyone's bought into this idea that you're actually all just trying to do the valuable thing for your customers and the business, and not about. It's about making the most of people's expertise. So we've got a DevOps team, for example, who are experts in a lot of that infrastructure, networking, security aspect. We consult with them. We might go, we want to use this new technology. How would we best do that? We understand how they would approach it. We work with them. We get it set up as a POC. We put it into production. But the team themselves actually own it and are responsible for it. It's not been outsourced to DevOps to go and implement. And then you have a problem at 2 a.m. It's your dev and QA. You get woken up on the team, and then they go, but it was DevOps who actually did this.
And that's when you have too many handoffs. It can often lose sight of that common goal. It's very easily done.
And there's another bit there as well, which is that to me is often a lot about autonomy. But the team leads the teams in general, they need to understand what is it that we must care about as a business. Certainly within the industry that Betway is within. There are many regulations, and that keeps us very conscious of what we're doing has to be done in a very good, methodical way. So it's not about being quick and kind of easy and doing things the cheap way and the wrong way just to get it out there. No, it's actually almost the other way. You need to be very methodical with this. You have to have it the right process. The right process doesn't need to be slow and difficult. It can be quick and easy, but it's quality.
Nice.
And it takes time. None of this is to get to a point of being able to do releases quickly is not a quick process.
That felt too true. That felt quite close to the vein. That one. It feels like it should be, but unfortunately not. Is that how you got to is that how you? I know you covered this off a little bit earlier, but is that kind of how you led to your journey of like implementing Trunk? Was that your sort of you needed that quick process and you needed to do the work to like.
Yes, and again, so our teams can use full-on trunk-based development. Some teams still use a Git flow approach of having kind of release candidate branches, and they merge into that. Then you check that, then it goes into the main branch, and then it goes on from there. But again, it is about that speed. I think when you start really using feature management in anger, you start looking at these things and going, but what value are we getting from a release candidate branch now? What's the security that it is providing us versus the security that every deployment is putting new code in an off state to customers? That might now mitigate the need of managing many, many Git branches. And that's one thing that I advocate. As I say, the teams can choose the way in which they want to work within our kind of software development lifecycle policy. And so they can choose Git flow if they want, but I will always advocate once you're fully using feature management, you probably don't need quite such a kind of verbose manner of branches, because you can get bogged down in that, and then you end up with merge conflicts, and then you're spending time figuring out, okay, how do we get this new feature in? And then you want to get a hot fix out quickly, and then you bypass all of that. Well, that I find interesting, because why should a hot fix be able to get to production much more quickly than any fix? What's the difference between a hot fix? Oh, you want it done quickly, but surely everything we want done quickly.
Exactly. And where does that lie? Where do you draw the differentiation there? Because then that kind of really falls back onto how we're organized and how we're incentivized as a team. And I feel like that's kind of why throughout the rise of DevOps, we kilter between talking about the advent of people and the advent of process and how those two intersect, and one really does power the other. Yeah. I was also kind of curious. This is a little bit of a like a personal one. So you've been a Microsoft MVP for some time now.
Yes.
How's the process been? And has it kind of changed the way that you lead your developer team? I'm really curious.
So you've been an MVP since 2012. So yeah, a good amount of time. Nice. And it's brilliant. What's nice about it is that community aspect of being an MVP. And partly it's about being able to give back and contribute, and partly it's about being able to learn and meet other like-minded, but also other people with different backgrounds and cultures and interests. And that's quite a fascinating kind of space to be in, that appreciation of kind of celebrating differences and different backgrounds and people and technologies.
Yeah.
It does kind of bleed into then what I'm doing in the job and how we work as teams as well, because it's about that opportunity to be open and to collaborate and to meet and celebrate successes.
I was thinking about what was you talking about, sensing what customers really got value for. I was pretty sure that you obviously must have a sense of that when you're running your wallpaper app. You see what resonates with people the most, what people just really have strong reactions to, because I mean the artwork we display around ourselves, it's very subjective. Yeah.
There's a good Star Wars one behind you, I can see.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I created wallpaperhub.app as being part of that Microsoft community, because I liked some of the wallpapers that Microsoft has used, either as Windows or Surface devices, whatever. And actually, I just shared them when I found them, and people absolutely loved them. And I was like, well, actually, maybe I should do more than just tweet the picture out. Maybe I could actually put something. And at the time, React was relatively new. And so I'm more of I used Angular many years ago, and then React was new, but I'm more of a .NET developer when it comes to server-side stuff. Obviously, being a Microsoft MVP, that's almost a no-brainer. And so actually, Wallpaper Hub is a React server-side rendered .NET server web app, which is not that common, but it was allowed me to play with React, but without having to completely start fresh with a new technology. I could make the back end side of it is .NET, and then everything in the kind of the presentation layer is React. So that was a good way of keeping up to date with technology, because at the time we weren't using React. We now are using React quite a lot at work, but it was a good way of learning that and playing around with that. And yeah, if you kind of run a website like that, you have to appreciate, but what do customers actually respond well to? What do customers want? And you have to, I might not do it much with Wallpaper Hub, but certainly with work, that kind of approach leads us to understand what are the success metrics of a product. And that is really the only way you can run good experiments, I would say, is to know what actually you're trying to get improved in that product. What's the metric that you're aiming to improve a percentage point here and there? And then every feature you're experimenting, you're proving whether that's happening or not. And every conversation that you have with stakeholders are trying to understand, well, okay, if we do that feature, in what way do we think that product's improved? What metric has just got a slight uptick because of that? Which certainly helps remove in cases where a stakeholder wants it, and that's kind of the justification, that's enough. Having metrics that everyone buys into as to, well, that's why this product exists, actually changes that conversation. And it can't just be because someone wants it, it's because there's a thinking here, and it could be wrong, and we have to be accepting that we might spend some time implementing that new feature only to find it's not what customers want. It doesn't add the value we think. Well, okay, then we've spent some time. We don't want it in the code base anymore, but we've learned something, and that's very valuable. Not in the instance to the bottom line of the business, perhaps, but it will be very valuable in the long-term bottom line of the business, because you're discovering more about your customers, and it's only through knowing what your customers really want that your business is going to be most efficient and effective at what it does.
Exactly. When you know better, you do better. When you're able to operate from that one single version of the truth, it really changes the way that people interact. We can really unite around a problem together. I know that sounds very, I've gone very SRE, just we will become united. But in terms of what the future looks like for the state of DevOps, do you think these, we're in our 11th year, 12th year of the State of DevOps report now. The Accelerate metrics, the Delra metrics have really kind of changed the way that we're all working. Do you think metrics is in the future of what we're doing? Like, where do you see things headed?
I think so. And I think it's quite interesting. Certainly we, over time as a company, have said that we're data-driven, but not necessarily are data-driven. And I think that we're beginning to discover that ourselves, that we're becoming more data-driven. And I think where feature management might be an extension to DevOps, we might see some more kind of DORA metrics coming through, or some revisions there, where it's a little bit more fine-grained metrics now, and actually being able to roll out and hypothesize and have that hypothesis-driven engineering approach. And we're going to have numbers baked in more in terms of what it's not just about being able to deploy stuff. It's about making sure that what is deployed and then what's released is valuable and successful.
Definitely.
Because we're getting good at being able to make change now. So now we want to make sure that the changes that we're making are valuable changes.
And that value per deployment. I wonder whether or not that's going to be the
maybe, yeah.
Next. Okay, we can leave that as our crystal ball moment.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me. I've had a wonderful time discussing the future of DevOps with you, and hopefully we get to have a lovely time for the rest of Microsoft Build.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. And I will just say, because it would be silly of me not to, that if this kind of conversation has been interesting and the stuff that we've discussed has been interesting, then I do have a book which covers this in a lot of detail. It's called Feature Management with LaunchDarkly. So it's available on all good retailer websites and stuff. But it covers this and a lot of tips and tricks and experiences of how to do feature management, focusing on doing that with LaunchDarkly.
It is. Where can people follow you and keep up to date with your future releases and hopefully get a copy of your book? And it's online on Amazon, but
yes, it's available on Amazon. Twitter's probably the best place to follow me, and it's at Michael Gillett.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Michael Gillett.
Thank you.
Take care.